This just might be the biggest change in automotive in the past 40 years, and people aren't really talking about it. Hey, it's Tim, Pickup Truck Plus SUV Talk. In this video, we're going to talk about Chevron. We're going to talk about this law precedent was in place from the Supreme Court. And it basically, the law came out to be that they took the power away from the judges and they put it in the hands of agencies. So what the Chevron doctrine said was that in the case of a law that's not very specific, a general law that's ambiguous, that the agency experts could go ahead and decide what that law actually meant and implement it. It allowed agencies like the EPA to expand in areas that caused a lot of controversy to people. A lot of people were concerned that the EPA was abusing its power and going above and beyond what the Congress had actually said was their job. So it's creating a lot of questions out there. I've seen some videos, I've seen conversations online, people talking about, can they just delete their diesels now because the EPA doesn't have power over that emissions? Or can they get away from all this turbocharged V6s? Can we go back to V8s? There seems like a lot of controversy about this. And so I reached out to two experts. We're going to hear in this video from Karen Bailey Chapman. She's a Senior Vice President of Public and Government Affairs for the Specialty Equipment Market Association. I want to make sure I say SEMA correctly, also known as SEMA. We're also going to hear from Chris Harto. He is a Senior Policy Analyst with Consumer Reports. Both of these people have decades of experience looking at public policy, seeing what's going on in the realm of the laws and implementations in the automotive industry. And they have some really interesting things to say about Chevron. There are two interviews. I'm going to go ahead and try to merge these best I can in my editing skills and give you guys a really good idea of where we're at right now and where we could be in the future as Chevron has been overturned. And now I'm joined by Karen Bailey Chapman. She's a Senior Vice President, Public and Government Affairs for the Specialty Equipment Market Association. Welcome, Karen.
Morning, Tim.
So I'm curious, does that all fit in the business card?
It does, actually. Really small font, but it fits.
It is. I love these titles. These titles crack me up.
I know.
So SEMA, and I've been to the SEMA show. I've been a part of the group in different years. But for those who don't know, SEMA is a you have the bio right here. What I missed, but it works with small businesses in the automotive space, protect their rights, and to make sure they can go to marketplace and not be hampered by government regulations, which is what we're talking about today. Look at that segue! Wow, I'm on point. It's amazing. And now I'm seeing questions online. I'm seeing videos. Guys are like, hey, I'm gonna go delete my diesel because now Chevron doesn't exist anymore, and I'm gonna go ahead and do this and do that, and I'm like, well, hold on a minute. The world changed, but it didn't change, right? So, as you wrote in this little thing, it says what the overturning of Chevron does not allow people to do is break the law. If the law is a law, still the law.
Right. That's my phrase. I walk around the office saying the law is the law. The law is the law.
So what do you make of these people that they're saying, hey, I can delete my diesel now because Chevron's not in enforcement anymore, and EPA definitely outstepped their bounds, and we got to get back to 1970s emissions.
Right. I mean, look, I appreciate the enthusiasm, and the fact is, it is an historic decision by the Supreme Court. But to go back to the catchphrase, the law is still the law. So it did not overturn the Clean Air Act. It did not overturn the laws that prevent us from using delete systems or eliminating the emission systems. So, but what it does do is just change how anybody that is enforced against with regard to these systems and how it's viewed within the courts and how it's handled within the courts versus before.
All right, I'm joined by Chris Harto, Senior Policy Analyst at Consumer Reports, and we're talking more about Chevron. I'm just really curious about your thoughts on this because it just passed, and I'm seeing videos of people saying I'm going to delete my diesel tomorrow and I'm going to get rid of all this stuff. The EPA has no claim over this stuff anymore, and because Chevron has changed back to the way the rule of law should be with the Constitution, I'm going to go ahead and delete my stuff. So when you hear that, do you go, oh, wait, hold on? Or do you go, oh, well?
Yeah, definitely don't do that. The case, the looper brake case, which overturns the Chevron doctrine, does not immediately change any regulation on the books. All it does is potentially make it easier in the future for lawsuits to change or overturn certain regulations. So unless you want to be the guinea pig case that tries to overturn that and spend the next 2 or 3 years in court trying to fight it, I wouldn't recommend doing that right
what else should people know about deleting their diesels?
Yeah. So again, this case, this looper break case, is really about agency interpretation of the law, and the Clean Air Act is actually very clear about tampering with emissions controls. The law says very specifically that it is prohibited to tamper with your vehicle. And so even with this case, the courts are unlikely to say that it's okay for you to tamper with the emissions controls on your vehicles. That's probably going to require an act of Congress to change that if you want to be able to continue to do that.
So, I mean, looking at your information, and you did an article on the big day and how it was overturned. There's a lot of like questions now moving forward. What is this? What is this? What's it mean for, I think we have two pieces here. We have the what's already in place, and we know that emissions related equipment was in the 1970s Clean Air Act. They had a way to do that. Then they redid the Inflation Reduction Act and added greenhouse gas wording in there as well. So the EPA seems like they're pretty much set where they're at. We're not going to roll that back, right?
Well, I mean, that's actually being, especially with the newer regulations, especially the tailpipe emission standards that they finalized earlier this year. This is going to give a different perspective from the court systems in terms of the challenges that are being brought forward with the new emission system or the new emission standards that have been released by the EPA. But kind of stepping back a moment here and saying, okay, so what does this do? So what was the Chevron doctrine, right? And so the Chevron doctrine was 40 years of legal precedent that basically gave courts or required courts to give deference or defer to the federal agencies that when the law was either silent or ambiguous, that if the agency kind of filled in the blanks, the court gave deference to that. So the overturning of Chevron takes that away from sort of that precedent. And so what does that mean for our industry? That means now whenever you have a challenge to a law where say our industry says it's this way and the EPA says no, it's that way. When we go to the courts, now the courts must say, no, this is actually what the law says. So if you if federal agency, you filled in the blanks, or the law was kind of ambiguous and you filled in the blanks or unambiguatized it. Sorry, it's a word. I make up words. If you unambiguatized it,
It's a good word.
the court's no longer required to say, oh, okay, federal agency, we have to defer to what you say. The courts have to go back and say, no, the law said this. And so then the courts make that decision. So if sort of in simply put, it kind of gives our industry a better day in court and more of that opportunity in court whenever there's a challenge between what we believe versus what, say, a federal agency is saying it should be.
Writing the article, I was looking up the Inflation Reduction Act, and I was like, well, this, along with the changes to the Clean Air Act over the years, says emissions and greenhouse gases as part of the EPA's job.
Yeah, and really what this case says is, you have to stay, the agencies need to stay within those bounds of what it says. When it's a little bit unclear, then the courts can weigh in. Used to be they said, well, the agency knows what they're doing. We're going to defer to whatever their interpretation is of that, whatever this statement in the law that maybe is a little bit unclear or vague. Now it says, no, that's not the case. It's actually, the court's role to determine what what that vague language means and where the line is on what you can and can't do as a regulatory agency. So it doesn't, it shifts the burden of proof really a little bit away from the agency. But it doesn't, if the law says you can't delete your pickup truck, then you can't delete your pickup truck. And actually, in some ways, this case could make it worse because, EPA has stated and has chosen to, only selectively enforce this law. They've said they're not going to enforce it on race cars or off-road vehicles. They're not going to go after, Jeff, who lives in Oklahoma in his driveway. They're not going to go after him. They're focusing on some narrow enforcement an environmental NGO could sue and say, actually, the law says this is illegal. EPA choosing not to enforce this law more broadly is a problem. And, the law is very clear that this is illegal. So choosing to not to enforce it on some people this could actually, come back to make it even worse in the case of delete devices. Like the Chevron case itself, the original case was the oil company Chevron suing. It was a EPA wanted to set a weak standard, and the court said, no, you are. Basically, it gave the agency the authority to set a weaker standard than maybe what it should have. Like it said, oh, we did defer to the agency in a case that it was actually a deregulatory case where they were trying to weaken rules. And the court said, yeah, okay, you can do that, and we're going to defer to the agency's judgment on this versus no, the law says, yeah. Anyway, it's interesting. So it can cut both ways in terms of whether it leads to deregulation or increased regulation, depending on the how that what the history is and what the law says
and how it all plays out in court. So
yeah.
Have you been surprised at the amount of attention the Chevron case getting right now? I mean, you've been interviewed, I'm assuming, a couple times. I'm doing an interview. People are talking about
it. Not really. I mean, it is a big change. It's a bit, it's something that's been in place for 40 years. It's been kind of the law of the land, and it's been used in hundreds of different cases. So it is a shift. It is it definitely leans in general in the deregulatory direction. It is, I think there's, I work mostly on cars and emissions, on the emissions side of things. I think where it maybe gets a little trickier is my colleagues who work on the safety side. And, some of those statutes are a little more vague. It just depends on where in the regulatory space you are, how risky it is and how much it changes. But it certainly means, there's always the lawsuits, but I think there's more chance of some of those lawsuits being successful.
No, I mean, I'm following pretty closely because of my audience and my outlet covering trucks exclusively and SUVs. And I've had a few friends reach out with the news, and they're all celebrating. And I'm like I told you earlier, I don't think that's the case. I think you're.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a little bit overblown on both sides, both the pro-regulatory side, panicking, and the anti-regulatory side kind of celebrating and being like, oh, it's anarchy. We can do whatever we want. Nothing, none of this stuff matters anymore. That's not what it says. And what it probably means from a legal perspective is it matters a lot more which judge you get. So there's a lot of which court does the case go to? It gives a lot more. Our courts have become more polarized, unfortunately, and politicized in a not very productive way in both directions. And so it just gives more power to those judges to make determinations that they might not have previously had the authority to do.
And one of the things that I've been seeing that's been kind of, you guys talk about it as well, Preserving the Choice in Vehicle Purchase Act. It's a federal bill, and what you're looking at is California. There's been a lot of waivers in recent years to California. EPA has given them different waivers. The California Air Resource Board basically set some higher emission standards in the rest of the country. Other states adopt it. It seems like that is a point of contention that is something that could be challenged in court, because I don't, as far as the audience knows, is a good example of this, because I don't recall that the EPA has the power to give those waivers in the law.
Well, I mean, that's, I think, what we're going to start to see in the court systems and testing that theory. Look, under the Clean Air Act, California was allowed to make its own rules because their emission systems, their emission standards predated actually the federal. They
Okay.
also have some unique geographies dealing with smog and whatnot with the mountains and the ocean and sort of how that all in the harbors. So they were given that permission. There are questions as to the now 16 other states that have attached themselves to California emission standards, saying, okay, is that actually legal? And I think we may see that challenged in the courts. But it also goes back to really what the federal government recently did this spring when they put out the final rules with regards to tailpipe emissions. That's actually being challenged in the courts, and that will now, with the overturn of Chevron, it's going to force the courts to take a different look at this and not give deference to the EPA. I actually just saw an article this morning come across my desk where the DC Circuit Court, which is where it's the first line of courts that you have to go to when you challenge a federal agency, they've actually gone and said, we actually need new briefs on an issue related to actually tailpipe emissions, as well as the fuel economy standards that the government's pushed. This is up till model year 26. So it's the previous set of emission standards that were put forward. They said we need to get this sort of rebriefed by the parties because of the Chevron deference, or because of the overturn of the Chevron deference. So we're already seeing it, just a couple weeks later, since that court decision, saying, okay, the courts have to now start to look at this differently.
I thought that was the emission stuff, and tailpipe emissions was part of the Clean Air Act, was the EPA's role in doing that. So if they're, I'm not a legal scholar at all, but I'm just thinking, for challenging that moving forward, doesn't that make a bigger changes in the past?
Well, what it actually does is that where sort of you see the litigation starting to play out with the current emission standards that were put forward, is the fact that the government actually can't choose the technology. They can't say you can use this technology, but not that technology. I think that's the big thing with the California ACC2, which is the complete elimination of the internal combustion engine. That's an elimination of technology. We don't believe the authority was given to the EPA to choose one technology over the other. They can set standards, but you can't eliminate technologies.
And speaking of the technologies and things, do you think I've seen people do some videos and articles about how this reduces the EV mandate push? They're feeling. They feel like the federal government has an EV mandate and it's going to go all EVs, and they feel like this may overturn that push.
Well, we believe that this actually, we have a good chance of overturning what's been put in place. There's both obviously the legal fight over whether or not the EPA could choose to make the regulations mandating one technology over another, but then there's also the political outcomes. It's obviously a top issue in the presidential campaigns right now. It's one of the probably top 3 issues that you see mentioned. So you're seeing it played out sort of in both parts of our government, both on the political side as well as on the judicial side.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that are really enthusiastic about this changing ruling. There's been a lot of thought over the years that the EPA has been moving way too fast. And if you look at the last 20 years of trucks, a lot's changed, right? So we have diesel emissions, we have small displacement V6 engines, we have multi-speed transmissions, we have a focus on CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. Do you see like a big court case going forward, all that kind of stuff, or do you think we'll just have a period of calm? Has the EPA had enough regulations passed in the last couple of years to update the Clean Air Act that they're fine, or where do you think we're at with that?
I think we've definitely seen a lot of new regulations passed during this administration. We'll see what happens, over the next 4 years. They certainly could, they've done a lot, and there's probably a period of pause on significant new vehicle regulations coming up, but definitely going to be a lot of fights in court over the regulations that have been passed over the past 3 or 4 years. Pretty much every rule that EPA ever writes gets challenged by somebody, whether it's the auto industry, whether it's the oil industry. There's always a lawsuit.
Yeah, and you have a quote here in Auto News that jumped out to me. It says the CAFE standards will push some improvement to the fleet. CAFE is corporate average fuel economy, but the rate of improvement for the fleet would decline significantly, at least what is required by regulation. You're going from a standard that is pushing pretty significant amounts of electrification to marginal improvements year over year. I think that's people's takeaway has been like this EV push from the government is not going to be substantiated by the Clean Air Act and not from the changes happened to that. And so Chevron being overturned.
That again will be something that'll be litigated by the court, but and sort of we have these two sources of regulation for light duty vehicles. We have the Department of Transportation's corporate average fuel economy rule, which is really very narrowly focused on the fuel economy of gasoline powered vehicles. And then you have EPA's emission standards, which include not just greenhouse gases, but particulate emissions, NOx, other harmful pollutants that are allowed to include electric vehicles and push they're allowed to set the rules based on the technology that's available in the market. And certainly some of this will be fought out in the court in terms of how far EPA is allowed to go with those regulations or not.
And so you guys have 7,000 member companies. What's your sense on the companies, your membership's viewpoint on this? Are they excited for the overturning? Are they like, I don't think it's gonna change anything? They're kind of so. Where are we at with this?
I think people are pretty heartened. It's nice to finally feel like we've got a bit of a win because the industry has been sort of felt, I think, to be under attack for several years now. But just to put it into a numbers perspective, the industry that we represent, specialty automotive aftermarket industry, we're a $337 billion impact to the U.S. economy. So then breaking that down a little bit further, 33% of our members are internal combustion engine dependent. So they make parts that are only internal combustion engine. So it's, wheels and tires, not impacted. If you do reupholstering, you do stereo systems, you paint, not impacted. But 33% are ICE dependent. So what does that translate to? That's over $100 billion of impact to the U.S. economy that's at risk. When you think about our industry employs 1.3 million people across the country, largely obviously in small businesses, that's over 300,000 jobs that are at risk from small businesses. So our industry is obviously very concerned about the fact that this is a pretty significant impact given the magnitude of what we represent, what we contribute to the U.S. economy, the jobs that we create, and our ability to continue forward.
Wow, that's a lot of moolah.
It's a lot of moolah.
Or money or cash, as kids call it these days. And so from a standpoint, you guys talk to a lot of consumers. Well, Consumer Reports. Yeah. You talk to a lot of consumers. It's in the name. So I'm just curious, what kind of advice are you giving consumers now that Chevron has been overturned? Are you doing a wait and see approach? Are you saying nothing's going to, it's fine? Where are we at with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think nothing is changing overnight here. What the Chevron case really means is that regulators need to be very careful when they're writing the regulations to make sure they're staying within the bounds of the authority that Congress gave them. It probably means that Congress needs to be a little bit better at writing the laws. A lot of times Congress gets a little lazy and they write things in sort of wishy-washy, vague language on purpose because they don't want to have to take the time to really narrow it down and be very specific. And so it means more work both on the regulatory side and in Congress in how you write these laws and how you write these regulations. So it's more of an over time, what sort of shifts do we see?
Okay, what did you guys think of that? It's a pretty interesting interviews I was able to conduct. And thank you both to Karen and to Chris. And I was thinking as I was doing these interviews, is this much ado about nothing, or is it still a really big deal? It's an interesting question in my head, and I don't know that came to a conclusion, but I'm curious if you guys came to a conclusion. Do you think this could be a massive change, EPA, or do you think it's just going to be status quo moving forward? I'm up in the air on this. I'll be curious to read your comments. Also, make sure to check out the videos on this channel over here. Website down below as well, pickuptrucktalk.com. As always, thanks for watching. I will see you down the road.